It's thinking about it. All right. We are now live, boys and girls.
We're recording?
Yep, we're going. We're there.
You sure the recording light is on?
We're live on the Facebook. I don't know that it's... Yeah, it should be.
Alright. Welcome to another episode of the Unifying Force. I'm Kat, joined by Dave and Kylo Ren. And we all float down here today.
Yes, we all float down here.
We are live, alive, and kind of mobile.
Yes, I am with us from a remote location today. I am shooting a sporting clays competition today, so I am in a remote location. I promise I'm not actually driving. But it's kind of like Camp Crystal Lake out here, so it's sort of befitting our topic.
Oh, sure. That sounds like the perfect segue into the theme of today's episode.
Horror movie.
Yes.
Halloween special.
Yes. Who wants to kick it off?
So what are we? Episode 35 of Unifying Force? And,
We're in the 30s somewhere.
We're doing a holiday special in a way, but the holiday is spooky season with Halloween around the corner, and we're looking at the idea of Halloween and how it relates to Star Wars. So we can talk a little bit about the day and the event itself and the kind of season. We can look at how it's another cultural event that has a lot of history and sociological context that feeds in nicely to our kind of cultural analyses that we've done in the Unifying Force episodes. And we can link that more specifically into Star Wars and how Star Wars could be compatible, or maybe not so much, with not Halloween, but the horror genre itself and horror fantasy fiction. So with that, I think it would be a good starting point to just really talk about Halloween and the impact of Halloween.
Halloween, the harvest, holiday of the harvest. Celtic holiday as well, honoring the dead and all that. And then eventually you have Day of the Dead crossover in Latin America for November 1st around the same time, which is kind of neat because the Celtic Halloween holiday goes back centuries, over only 1,000 years. And yet you have in the other hemisphere, before there's any contact, you already had Day of the Dead type things going on as well. And it's like right around the same time for the same thing. It's the harvest. And the Halloween whole thing, trick-or-treating stuff, is the idea that kids are going door to door and if you give them candy, the spirits will stay. The spirits that they're dressed up as will stay away from their house and won't haunt them. Just that
Oh,
kind of
so
thing.
Geo's
Whereas
warding
if it's
off
Day of the
Kylo
Dead,
Ren. He's like keeping him out right there. It's like no more Kylo Ren.
yeah, and that's kind of neat because it's like
I feel the pull to the light, though.
it's like the Western culture of Halloween is all about keeping the monsters and the ghosts away, whereas
Yeah.
like in Latin America, it's all about embracing them and living with them and celebrating them.
Well, because it's more
Just
in
another
Latin
form of how
America.
certain-
It's less of monsters and it's more of spirits of benevolent spirits, you know,
Exactly.
of your relations. So it's inviting in as opposed to keeping
That's it.
out.
Right, and undoubtedly the demonization of everything foreign had something to do with Halloween in the West becoming associated with, oh, dark and evil because, oh, it was Celtic, it was Latin, it was different. And so then it all got,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, all that kind of thing. But
Yeah, the
that's
kind of
why Halloween is one of the funnest holidays of the year because it's diverse, it's out there, and it relates to how does it relate to Star Wars? Well, there's some things in Star Wars. I think the most overtly horror related Star Wars property was probably the Galaxy of Fear book series from the 90s. That was it was basically trying to compete with Goosebumps, and it was a lot darker and the crazy stuff. You had like zombies coming alive and eating people alive. You had the doomsday robots coming to try and take over the galaxy. You had like the brain eaters, the locust, all sorts of crazy stuff going on. And the main characters were like these kids and their cantankerous uncle who were like archaeologists or whatever driving around. And it's like, okay, it was a fun series, but I'd say that was probably overtly horror for Star Wars stuff.
I don't know.
But
The
we've
thing
seen
in Star
certain
Wars,
carryovers and
yeah.
the thing in Star Wars that scared the holy bejesus out of me was The Last Jedi. But no, seriously, I kid. It's,
I think the Rise of Skywalker was scarier. That at least had demon people and hoods and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, and if we're talking as
During their
a
demonic
movie,
shit.
something that's been Frankenstein monstered into life, that's definitely
well, what
the end
I
of the
think
saga.
we've got to consider is George Lucas's original intent is Star Wars as a movie for children does have scary kind of horror vibes and things that would scare children. You know, there are people that we know, Spencer Jones, that have, you know, had to leave a Star Wars film as a child because it was so scary. I mean, for me, I mean, just thinking the obvious one is the cave. You know, don't go in the cave or the tree or whatever it was. It was a tree that was a cave. But, you know, you've got your jump scare kind of things. You've got the Wampa. You've got the Rancor. And there's definitely a lot of suspenseful moments that I'm not going to
The
name
Dianoga.
now. Let's see if you guys name some of the
Dianoga.
others.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you're rattling off them straight off the bat. I was thinking I could save this guy for a little later down the line, but yeah, if we're thinking over horror in terms of creature feature and monster stuff, Star Wars has plenty throughout the saga, and those are just if we're looking at the main 6 or 9 films as it is now. From A New Hope, you've got the Dianoga, and I think one of the most claustrophobic and terrifying moments in a mainstream kind of AAA, supposedly family-friendly blockbuster is the entire trash compactor scene with that entire sequence, which we can talk a little bit more about. But when horror and Star Wars come to mind in terms of horror elements and scary moments, that I think in kind of release order chronology, I think is the first overtly horrific moment in Star Wars. In Star Wars, the 1977 film, A New Hope, Episode 4, and in terms of the franchise overall. And I think that sets the bar for what Star Wars could do going forward, not just in terms of on-screen and in-story and character moments, adversities to overcome, the survival element that's so key to a lot of horror fiction, but also technically what George Lucas and ILM in its infancy could do on screen, and really using some of the more subtle techniques just to build suspense that I think were exemplified maybe best commercially by George Lucas's very good friend Spielberg in Jaws. The fact
Yeah.
that you've got a hidden monster below the water level, you don't show much of it. Less is more, and with that, you have a creeping tension that can ramp up. But yeah, that's my thoughts immediately on monsters in Star Wars. But there are so many, so we can keep
Well,
going.
I mean, I'll go and agree because you mentioned Jaws right there, and that is probably by far my favorite horror movie. And you can argue whether that's an action,
Up
it's an
there,
adventure, but yes, up top. I mean, Jaws has got to be
yeah,
it, and the
Digital
original
5.
Jaws, not the rest of them that are technically specifically classified more as a horror movie, but the shark was scarier when the shark didn't work, when they had to go for other places, and they were building that suspense and you couldn't see the shark. You're just the music, John Williams. But
Yeah.
there's your horror adjacent to Star Wars, is John Williams doing the music for Star Wars, John Williams doing the music for Jaws.
It's a
Yeah,
fine connection right there.
I've never bought Jaws as a horror film. I've never really understood that, but that's a fun movie. Horror in Star Wars, yeah, they do a lot of creature feature type stuff. Like, there's always a bigger fish, and
Yeah.
the three beasts from the Genosian arena, and the fact that the Genosians are like giant bugs, which Hollywood loved that stuff back in the 50s, just nonstop onslaught of that. And even you had the Zillo Beast episodes of Clone Wars as a nod to Godzilla. And the Sarlacc pit, which was scarier before it had that ridiculous beak and tongue, because it was like just a
Little
you couldn't
Shop
really
of
tell
Horrors
how the
hybrid.
creature, yeah, you couldn't really tell what it was, or how it's like it's part of the sand. It's like, what is this thing? So they've always had creature feature moments, and then you have the more attempts at overt types of horror with Exegol, with old eerie type of stuff. But yeah, it's like horror leaking more over also into Clone Wars with like the Dathomir witches, which we talked extensively about in one of our first episodes, as well as cults in Star Wars. But then that also sees how other horror adjacent properties make their way into Star Wars, such as Marvel's recent Werewolf by Night.
Now that I found,
Exactly.
I did not know going in. Well, I did know going in just from what it said that Werewolf by Night was an MCU property, but I will find it very interesting if they really intend on bringing kind of the MonsterVerse into the MCU.
Right, because that was like setting up a lot of characters to the whole lore of the Bloodstone and this cult that's going on. And, oh, we have to stop these monsters because they're hurting, the regular public out there. So you have to help us kill these things. And the beast Ted is sort of like a cross between Swamp Thing and Cthulhu.
A lot of homages right there, yeah.
And then you have like the fact that they did it in black and white and added all the flicker effects to make it look like an old timey horror film. And when he's finally transforming into the werewolf, you only see it through shadows on the back of the wall, which is kind of neat. Much more inventive than just watching a CG transformation.
Exactly right.
But yeah, it's like and in the sense that, being a throwback to those old early horror films, which weren't really scary, but they were always fun. Like Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Invisible Man, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Bride of Frankenstein, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think, it really allows the medium of TV and streaming services to show that you can have this room for diverse genre filmmaking in the MCU, and the techniques they use in terms of being a little more subtle about it, perhaps using black and white and the grainy texture as a way of making it less overtly frightening, just on a visceral color level, if there's any gore. It's something that a Star Wars property could use as well, while giving it this sort of archaic or period film sort of ambience to it. As well as, I think I really love the fact that something as ostensibly central to the plot of Werewolf by Night, a werewolf transformation, is played out with discretion and subtlety as shadows on the wall. It reminds me of, I think, one of the very first kind of gothic horror films, Nosferatu, and how there's a lot of use of shadow and background lighting and ambient lighting to create a sense of absolute terror without having, something grotesque in your face or something immediately gory with, copious amounts of blood and grisliness and gruesomeness. You can do that sort of thing and create, at the very least, suspense and drama, but at the very most, some sense of chill and scare just by using more subtle techniques. I guess I keep coming back to the word subtle, looking for an alternative, but I think that's a good way of describing it. And I think it's a lot more powerful to do that on film and still have it impact you as an audience member. I just compare it to, I guess, the other famous werewolf in a fantasy big IP property that comes to mind is the werewolf transformation in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which I thought was handled a little badly. And this was superior in the ways that you've mentioned, Catherine, in the way that it was just discreet. And when less is more, it can work for horror in heavy ways.
Yeah, speaking of which, I was actually surprised that there actually was quite a bit of blood and gore in this special for MCU, given that Disney Plus has been going back and editing out scenes of blood and gore, and yet you actually see somebody get their throat cut open and their head impacted with like a pick or something, and blood. I mean, yeah, it's in black and white, but it's still there. And I thought, inconsistencies in the censors. Disney Plus.
Yeah. Yeah, the MPAA and whatever Disney Plus uses, there was a line that kind of jumping back and forth over.
Yeah, but I mean, I think
that
Werewolf by Night purposely harkened back to, let's bring it back around and tie it into Star Wars, the kind of old school Star Wars properties like Frankenstein movies and several different Dracula movies that would have had Christopher Lee in them. And who else was in those with Christopher?
Right.
There were
Peter
two
Cushing.
Star Wars actors that were in a bunch of those together.
Yeah, Peter Cushing.
Peter Cushing.
Yeah, Peter
yes.
Cushing, Christopher Lee, they're good friends, great, colleagues in a lot of those Hammer horror films from that sort of 50s, 60s London studios era.
Yeah,
yeah.
and
I think when just the word horror. Sorry to cut you off there, but just when you say horror and Star Wars, the first thing I think of is Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. In fact, before I actually think of anything specific within the Star Wars universe, if we're just talking actors who had prominent roles in the Star Wars saga, but also had huge prominence in the horror genre, those two, I don't think you can come up with a bigger 1-2 punch than those two.
No, absolutely not. I think the only thing that you would have is for people that are only familiar with like the more recent work and who haven't gone back and done that is Ewan McGregor and Dr. Sleep. That's what a lot of the people who are going to be the prequel generation are going to immediately go to, as opposed to the classic horror. So, and Dr. Sleep itself being kind of a sequel to not only The Shining, but it's a sequel to something else as well, I think.
To the Stanley Kubrick novel as well, because I think he was, to the Stephen King novel.
Yeah.
Switched to Stanley and the Stephen there, but I think that was one of the biggest surprises to me pleasantly in watching Dr. Sleep as a standalone horror film. The fact that it weaved a fairly consistent narrative and story and had strong character work, while uniting two very different interpretations of the original The Shining story with the Overlook Hotel and so on, because Stanley Kubrick and Stephen King famously didn't see eye to eye in what was on screen for the final cut theatrically. And I think Dr. Sleep was worked well as a sequel to the novel and a novel adaptation of Dr. Sleep, and it worked well as a sequel to the film The Shining. So I think it really fired off all cylinders really well. That would be Dr. Sleep 2018 film among my top rated horror films in kind of recent film history in sort of the last decade or so. I would put that right up there.
Yeah, and I think that's really kind of a hard thing to find, is recent horror films that I've found enjoyable, especially ones that are labeled as a horror film. There are other films that have been out there and suspenseful and scary that we might have called a horror film before that kind of are labeled as a different genre now. But you know,
Sure.
you finding things recent, and I still go back to recent, and I don't know that I agree with it, but you know, Aliens or Alien as a horror film is, I think that's more.
Alien, the first, absolutely.
But still, even in people saying
I
Alien
think Aliens is
became
a
way
little,
more of a sci-fi adventure. It would kind of
Yeah,
be,
yeah, the sequel is definitely an action movie.
yeah, like an
yeah.
action war
I
film
think it would be more of what I
in a
think we
way.
would see if they went and made a Star Wars horror film, which I would watch the heck out of, by the way, because we've talked about successes in Star Wars, and I think, you know, here's another tie to the current is I am enjoying Andor because of how much it is differed from our classic Star Wars and what we've gotten before. Is I would love to see them completely tackle a horror genre Star Wars movie, and I think there's so much content that they could build into that.
Yeah. Another recent horror film I think was probably good is this one right here,
I have not seen
Aha.
that. Tell us about that.
The Black Phone with
Neither have I. Very recent.
that was, I mean, up until, I mean, the ending I didn't care for, but it's like it feels like a throwback to the 70s. Like, you know, there's a kidnapper on the loose, and the way it goes about is things that would probably never fly today. But that's kind of deliberate because they want to make you feel like in a very specific time and a place, and just it's very atmospheric and eerie, especially since you don't really know what, like, he's not your standard kidnapper. He's not going to do what the standard child kidnapper is going to do. He's kind of a weirdo, and but it's like like Star Wars, he's wearing these masks, which you can read almost any expression into, but some of them have more overt expressions on it, where his eyes may be conveying something entirely different, giving like a really weird type of vibe off of it, which I thought, okay, that was a pretty decent horror film. As far as the modern ones go. And then you have other ones, very recent ones like Barbarian, which excels when you don't know anything about it going into it. The first 2/3 I think are excellent, and then after that falters. But I like how it's sort of something that doesn't start out overtly horror, like even in Star Wars, where you're in the like leading up to the trash compactor sequence. It's like a fun action adventure sci-fi, and you don't expect something like that's going to happen. It's like when it does, it's like,
Yeah.
oh great, the walls are closing in, which is like, of all the ways to die in any type of movie, that's pretty scary. And then you have the suspense that there's something under the water. And I don't believe it in the theatrical cut they actually showed the eyeball. I think that was a special edition ad, maybe. I think all they showed you originally was just the tentacle. So you didn't really know how big the thing was. And they're kind of like, is Luke going to die down there? It's
There were
not like,
definitely a few microseconds added into that sequence where there was the eye itself or not. But yeah, I completely take that. You're going from kind of like a gung-ho fun adventure with this trio, quartet, I guess, and then with the droids on the side, having this kind of adventure party, and it's very much a fantasy space western feel to it, and then they're suddenly physically, metaphorically, and literally dropped in it. And then you know, they're getting oppressed on all sides physically, as well as the kind of impending threat of the stormtroopers, Vader being on the actual battle station itself, trying to escape, get to the Falcon. So many kind of obstacles that are frequently found in kind of classic horror films and in horror moments, if not in, you know, an entire movie in and of itself, just really came to the fore in that kind of concentrated moment.
Well, and
So
I like
Star Wars has so much potential to use that again.
An illusion between horror movies that Catherine's mentioned a lot is like, I love the first 2/3 of it. I didn't like the end. I love the first two. You've mentioned that for several of these films. And that kind of harkens back to another classic horror film statement, I believe, by Steven Spielberg, when, you know, spoiler alert in Jaws, he just blows the shark. He's like, I've had them for this long. I can do whatever I want in the last scene. It doesn't matter. Is you're there for that amount of time. and that's the kind of thing in the horror genre that happens. It's like, okay, Michael, it disappears. He drops out the window. We've killed him again. We've killed him in this number of spectacular ways. But it's yeah, whatever is the ending, isn't the
another way I thought that killing the shark with the oxygen tank would legit work is if he shoots it and it causes it to because of all the air extraction, shot like a rocket in the back of its mouth and ripped out the shark's gills and you drown it. That would be that'd be pretty cool. So it's like, yeah, he had him, you got it. But yeah, it does that. And like, or like for instance, like certain movies which get expanded, which I don't think need to, like the first 13 minutes of Scream with Drew Barrymore is really good, a great short film onto itself. But then they add like 90 minutes of whole new characters, teen whodunit type of thing, just for the sake of doing it, or other films like It Follows starts with like a 30-minute, almost like a short film telling a beginning, middle, and end, really creepy story on its own, and then it goes on to meet all these other characters for the sake of bloating the runtime. So I like things because horror is a very difficult genre if you're trying to get people into a particular mood and tension field to go all the way to the end. Certain movies,
I was just gonna
like Halloween, do it, the original that is, do it very well, whereas none of the new ones do at all. Because it's like, because that thing, tension and suspense, is hard to do. And
you don't think there's enough tension and suspense in, what is it? Is it Resurrection, the one that has our Star Wars actor that has Katie Sackhoff, the Halloween?
Oh jeez.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, with Busta Rhymes. Yeah, let's and Tyra Banks.
Yeah. It's kind of like
let me mention while we're talking about it, Scream a little bit though, is that's one of those things that's the hill that I will die on. Is I've looked at in preparation for this so many lists, and so many people just list Scream in like the top 5 horror movies of all time, and I'm just like, no, you're wrong. And I mean, I don't want to be that guy, but I'm going to be that guy. That's the hill I will die on. Is the first however many minutes of that, I'll buy. The rest of that movie is like gory Scooby-Doo.
It's like I say it's kind of like a high school movie, but back in the era where you had college students playing high school, or 20-somethings playing high school kids, and it's like a whodunit, a teen whodunit mystery. That's all it is, with a guy running around in a Halloween costume. It's not really, it's a fun movie, but it's not a horror film.
They put enough gore in it to make
kind of Halloween themed in a way than horror itself.
Yeah, they okay, so that's a whole other thing that we'll have to visit toward Christmas. Then that argues, is it a horror movie because it's set in Halloween, or Die Hard? And that's I will die on that hill too. But we can get into that later.
I'd be with you for that one.
As they put enough gore into Scream to make it a slasher film, but how many of the gory slasher films are horror movies? I mean, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, yes, all day long. Friday the 13th, yes, all day long. Catherine's going.
I think that it really comes down to two things. There's a kind of we'll definitely defer to Catherine in a moment, but there's comes down to, I guess, what is horror as a genre and what is horror fiction? What makes it? What defines it? What are the kind of specialities that it does well that allow something to be considered that by most people? And then also the subjective side. What's horror to you and I? What do we find to be horror? And the entire cinematic experience, TV, film, phone screen, whatever it is, or any medium of fiction, is entirely down to our personal tastes and a direct product of all our experiences, environments, and all those various factors. So what scares one person might not scare another. What unsettles person A might not bother person B at all. And what can cause an absolute shock of adrenaline and maybe even the heart skipping a beat type sensation in another person could make another just laugh out loud. It's very, very different depending on the person. And I know we can say that about absolutely everything and every analysis and take and opinion of film and television, but I think with horror, it really comes down to personal preferences and what resonates with you in terms of getting you to feel fear, anxiety, the drama of suspense
Yes.
and tension.
Well, and you've hit
Sort of
on
like,
right there
you know,
another. Go ahead.
so sort of like how, you know, the first Nightmare on Elm Street is trying to be a horror film, tries to have this really dreamlike, unsettling quality all the way through, and the rest of them are just, you know, like slashers. It's like, yeah, let's not push this idea any farther. Which is why, but people will still prop up the sequels as, yeah, horror, and I'm like, really? You know, because like when you turn somebody like Freddy Krueger, a, you know, creepy child molester guy who invades your dreams, into a guy with comic one-liners, you can't really put that on him on the hill of horror anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
I
different
think
kind of thing. But what I was going for is some of the research and things that I looked into is, why do we enjoy horror? The physicality, the physical reasons why is that those endorphins, the adrenaline and the dopamine is likened to like a very natural opioid inside of your body. That relief after you've been scared and you're just like, whoa, is it's that visceral feeling that you get that makes you feel happy to be alive. It's like, okay, I'm glad I'm not those people. It's like,
Hmm.
and you know, do we get
And
that a little bit in some Star Wars movies? I, I mean, I've gotten that feeling in places. Is I think I mentioned originally the Rancor thing. And say what you will about
yeah.
Rise of Skywalker, I got that horror feeling that just when I thought they killed Chewie. You know, when the transport went,
Sure.
that was that visceral kind of like, would they do that? Would they there? You know, nowhere else in that
Yeah.
movie. Just
another
Definitely.
thing through this conversation I'm reminded of is the overt reference to this in the second season of Mandalorian, when they crash
Mandalorian,
land on a planet and they go into
the
the
white
cave.
snows, the ice spiders.
Have all the
Yeah.
spider eggs there, and they all kind of look like these facehugger eggs the way they're starting to open. And instead of facehuggers, the spiders almost look kind of like little facehuggers as they're crawling around, and you hear them all creak on the ground. And it's like, oh man, that is just. I mean, they don't turn into this, but it's still really
No,
creepy.
yeah,
It's
I
like,
think
Honestly,
that's
I would take a xenomorph over those ice spiders.
yeah.
I'd rather face down an alien from that franchise than
I
the
think that
giant ice
was
spider and that army.
a product of the time, because those ice spiders harken back to original Macquarie designs, right? Which were being done the same
Yeah,
time
they were
Yeah.
gonna
as
be.
the Geiger. How do you say it? The
Yeah,
same
they
guy
were
that,
gonna be like spiders who were disguised amongst the trees on Dagobah, so
H.R.
that you wouldn't
Geiger,
really
yeah.
see them until
Yeah.
they start moving. It's
yeah.
really
So
creepy.
it's coming out of that
But
same
Peter
period
in
of
Necronomicon.
what evolves and what scares us throughout time is those two designs, the ice spiders and the face huggers, were being kind of designed right there at that same time. So,
Mhm.
but
Definitely.
let
Yeah,
me open this one.
the
Let me open this can of
Mhm.
worms. Rogue One, the hallway scene. Horror? Not.
I kind of had like an elevated endorphin rush, like, oh, this is badass, because you gotta see Vader just wrecking shop, you know. I didn't think of it as scary, but I can certainly see how the rebels would think of it as scary. They're obviously very terrified as they're seeing this, and some of them, you see the expression on their faces, and they don't even know what to make of it. They've probably never seen Darth Vader before, or you know, and it's like, oh, gee. And some of the guys there, you notice, are like really young enough that they probably haven't seen a Jedi with a lightsaber before. So seeing Vader ignite his saber, it's like, what? And so it's horror for them, but I think for me as a fan, just because you've wanted to see that for so long without really thinking about it, to actually see it, it's like, yeah.
You're cheering for Vader.
Sure. I think that's why it comes. Yeah, I clapped for Vader hacking those rebels down. So I remember seeing a response, like a video review response to that scene back in late 2016 when Rogue One released. I think that's a great way of summarizing why that scene works on so many levels. You've got the the visceral audience response as a fan, as somebody who's a long time person who's invested in the series, and why that works for you in an adrenaline rush, the endorphin release, the physiological response of excitement and thrill, which I'd say is a little more akin to, I guess, the action rush that you can get, whether it's in film or in real life, with the sense of speed. And I feel it's that kind of rushed, heady feeling is something I associate more with, like going in a fast car or on a roller coaster ride or something like that. Some sort of machine that gives you a real physical rush. But then on the flip side, there's the definitely, I think you can say, a horror element to how it's portrayed in scene, and those terrified looks of absolute anguish, shock. There's no awe on those rebel soldiers' faces like there is on some of our faces when we see Vader ignite his red lightsaber in the dark. It's total fear and panic, and you see that acted so well. And I think that's what I think makes that scene effective on many levels, because it gives us that action rush and thrill of, this is Vader finally, the badass supervillain that we've always heard of but not really seen explicitly, and we're seeing his effect on his opposition, even though those are ostensibly the good guys. The way they react in total cowering terror makes it a horror scene in a way.
Yeah, see, in my opinion, I know I opened the can of worms, but I'm gonna go with, it's a horror when out of the dark he ignites the lightsaber. You don't know, the alarms are going off, dark, ignites the lightsaber, and you see him go forward. And after that, the horror is really gone, and it's more of an action or some other type of feeling. But they're
Yeah,
using that kind of
Sure.
out of
well,
the
yeah, 'cause it's
dark horror
always,
trope.
yeah, it's always
Sure.
what you don't see, which is scary. It's like, where's the monster? And then it's very difficult once your chase scene begins to maintain that.
Absolutely.
Oftentimes it falls apart once the chase scene begins, because it can often get silly. Like Jason Voorhees walking 2 miles an hour, if slower than that, with people running at like track speeds away from him, and he still catches.
Yeah. Well, and where you say it gets
Yeah,
silly too with the
I think
monster chasing, and as it was played for humor, is the scene on Han and Chewie's cargo ship where the beasts get loose, and Rathar, they get
the
loose,
Rathtars in the Force
and they're
Awakens.
rolling around
Yeah,
and moving through and killing people in the hallways. But that whole scene is completely played for comedy, with Finn and Rey's reaction to the whole deal.
Yeah,
So you kind of get to
yeah.
where, like,
Oh,
the whole other separate genre of the horror comedy, which doesn't seem like that would be a thing, but
yeah,
is all too often a thing.
yeah. I guess one film I'd say hits that the squarest on the head, I would say, is Shaun of the Dead. And so I know some people don't consider that a horror film, but it's draped in horror tropes and uses them incredibly well in kind of the traditional senses, and in the kind of deconstructing, satirizing, sending it up for comedy and for quick laughs. And I think that's what makes that film so effective, and be such a cult favorite, but then have huge broad appeal as well.
And
yeah,
that's
it's a
a
much
Because
Star
it
Wars
more
rides
tie-in
that.
as well,
it's a much
Simon
more clever
Pegg.
satire than Yeah, it's a much more clever satire than the scary movie type
Great
series.
segue.
Like Shaun of the Dead
Yeah.
is trying to tell. It's not really winking at the camera, because it's just telling like a straight up story, and then you just kind of follow it. And then they tried to repeat that with The World's End, with the whole Invasion of the Body Snatchers type vibe,
Mm.
but in the same fashion. It's not like winking at the camera. It's like you can pick up on it or you don't.
You could even argue the middle of that Cornetto trilogy by Edgar Wright is also has horror elements. Hot Fuzz, you've got a cult, You've got
That's right.
gruesome, grisly murders. You've got a kind of whodunit. You have horror elements. One word, one phrase that I wanted to use in a gut reaction to the Rogue One Vader hallway scene is horror adjacent. So I'd say that's the Rogue One horror elements to me make it horror adjacent, and not so much say it's kind of out and out horror filmmaking, especially as it develops into a more action scene. And I think in films like the ones we've discussed between Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright direction, they have horror tropes and familiarities within horror genres, and there are so many subspecialties within horror and subgenres that to use. And I think that's just another reason why we can all kind of say Star Wars has huge right pickings for further adapted tales and genre. One thing I really wanted to ask earlier on, before we kind of got in the weeds, is what is horror to you, to us? Like, kind of like we can go around and either define it from what we think is horror, or just explain it by way of horror films that either you think are the best or most effective, or you enjoy the most. And you kind of touched on it, that David, that horror is not necessarily a genre that you really revel in as much as say maybe another member of this panel.
Well, I think it's also, it comes down to more to how it's executed. Like, for instance, Hereditary from 2018, about the Coven of Witches or whatever, has this scene where the guy's driving home from the party and his sister gets her head cut off from leaning out the window. And the horror of that is you're just totally feeling horrible for the guy, and it's just a super awkward moment. Oh my God, how's he going to play this off? And it just really feels you the tension because it's shot so well and the atmosphere is there. But that's more like, on paper, a tragedy. It's not something that's like a horror movie in the traditional sense, but it works really well and really pushing you over the edge. So I think it doesn't always have to be, monsters or, alien invaders or zombies or stuff like that. I think it just, you could take an everyday situation like that, or everyday tragedy, and depending on how well you shot it and how you layer the music and stuff, you could turn it into a really horrifying thing. Like in Gone Girl, for instance, aside from all the overtly violent type of stuff going on and what she's doing, like towards the end of the movie, you're kind of sympathizing with this guy, and it's like you're trapped in this situation. It's like really scary, even though you're physically safe. Like nothing's going to happen to him, because that's her point. She doesn't want to really hurt him, but it's still really kind of scary. And that again comes down to the execution of, in that case, the director David Fincher. So I think it's a lot more in how you balance things.
So, I mean, my definition of horror is really, it's a movie that manages to scare me. I mean, all of us are pretty frequent movie-going people, and we know the tropes and we know the things. But if you have created your film and you have shot something that will scare me, that's the kind of horror movie that I'm enjoying. And a lot of times that can be a good jump scare. That can be, Jaws, still the suspense and the waiting for that to happen. I mean, I think I'm one of the few people of my generation who, I read the novel first. I read the Peter Benchley novel before I saw that movie, and still the movie frightened. Being scared to go back in the water, that happened. A movie that to this day I didn't get the chance, but I want to do it, is I saw when I was maybe 8 years old, Dreamscape with Dennis Quaid. Scares the holy bejesus out of me, to the point where I have never watched that film again. Ever. And that is, as ridiculous as it sounds, that is enjoyable. That, that is what I think is making of a good horror movie. That visceral feeling. What about you, Gio?
Oh, for sure. I think that it's going a little bit on to following on from what we discussed earlier. because it's such a case of the individual and your personal response to how you perceive things, how you might dwell on things, themes, moments, scenes, character, story elements, how you respond visually and auditorily to the kind of technical parts of a film, and what constitutes it, whether it's the score, the Foley sound department. All these things are integral to our visual auditory experience of film and television, but they are even more important, I'd argue, in horror, and definitely just have a greater presence in speculative fiction generally, of which science fiction and fantasy are arguably parts of, and horror is definitely a huge element. So it's interesting. I actually had 3 examples of horror films that I wanted to bring up because to me, they are horrifying in the sense that first watching, I had an overwhelming sense of dread, and I had that physiological response, and by that I mean that kind of palpable adrenaline rush, fight or flight feeling that you get, the kind of the sense that the tension and suspense in scenes can make you just feel have a strong emotional response, no matter what you feel. And it's one that you've already mentioned, actually. So, Catherine, that was my shout, if I can get it into view or not. That is Gone Girl. I think in terms of modern films, that's something I would argue is a incredible modern horror film, in a sense that it's kind of set in the parameters of our real world. There's nothing fantastical or supernatural to it, but I think it's easy sometimes for people to think that's what is horror, the paranormal, the unexplained, the mystery. But I would say you've got to dissect that, and it's the mystery that makes the horror. It's the unknown, it's the suspense that you can get as you go through this journey with characters that ideally you resonate with and you kind of like. Otherwise, certainly in some horror genres, it doesn't work at all. If there's kind of 2 ways I see slasher movies exist. On the one hand, you have the kind of the OG original true horrors, like the first Halloween, like the Friday the 13th, like first Nightmare on Elm Street, which have all those kind of foreboding film techniques, like the shadow, the lighting, the sound effects, the score creeping in, deathly silences, that we see used so well in other types of horror, like the sci-fi horror of Alien, and the sci-fi horror, I'd say, of Predator as well. So much suspense and tension in that makes that film incredibly visceral to experience first time. And when it's a visceral experience of adrenaline thrill and endorphin rush, for me, that's a film that I want to revisit, whether or not it makes me actually feel scared or not. So with Gone Girl, I think that because of the way it's so stripped down into being a very palpable and believable story with very real, grounded human characters, makes it that much more terrifying to me, because it's rooted in the psychology and identity of people in our worldly experience. And so to see things go so awfully wrong in many ways, and the kind of twists and turns, and the mystery of that film, and I guess of the book, because it's a fantastic adaptation as well, I've got to say. Filling in from what you mentioned about Jaws, and what makes, I think, some of the horror films that really hit hard work so well, is I think there have been some really successful adaptations that translate into horror well. One that I would say is more of an auteur original film, and one that I'm happily discuss, is this horror or is this not, is my other example of a modern horror masterpiece. It's Pan's Labyrinth. My camera is awful. Excuse me. It's Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, which to me, it doesn't scare me in the visceral sense of jump scare or those kind of instant, quick elements that you'd get in a slasher movie, in a monster movie. but it's the overall ambience, it's the themes, it's the kind of adversity of the central character, and I think it's a very relatable main hero that we follow in Ophelia in that story. Or was that on your list too?
All right, so we're getting close to the end of the deal, and we can go as long as we need to, but let's have kind of a little bit of a wrapping kind of thing. And I'll go first so you guys have some time to think. So top three horror films. Catherine, if you need to go 5 or 7, you can do that. That'll be okay. Is top 3 horror films, top 3 scariest moments in Star Wars. Okay. My top 3 horror films are going to be Jaws, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Dreamscape. It's that kind of thing. Is those are the ones that scare me. And top 3 scariest moments in Star Wars, I'm gonna go with the reveal, the Vader Luke fight in the cave, and the reveal of Luke's face in the helmet. Okay, that probably the Rancor, and then I think I'm gonna have to go with it because it's more recent and it's on my mind. Is what I had mentioned earlier, is when I thought Chewie was dead. That, and I don't know if that's an emotional moment, and I can't grasp whether did that horrify me or did that sadden me, but it's a very visceral moment. So that's just what I think. So Gio, you want to tackle that next?
Well, yeah, I brought 3 examples of what I think are great modern horror films. So I'll just fill out with the third one, which I think is maybe more up for debate than the other 2. It's David Fincher's Seven. Now, I subjectively and kind of in a more impartial sense feel that Seven is a fantastic horror film. It's one that, because the central mystery, has always made me think that other filmmakers could do a similar story, and it could just be an absolutely fantastic experience. And I'm so glad that David Fincher took some elements of Seven in one of his later works, in Zodiac, which I'd say is more horror adjacent and not really horror specific at all, but has definite elements of horror in it. Which brings me back to the scary moments in Star Wars. So for me, the ones that I guess I'll go for 3 kinds of responses that I think horror films can give us. So the visceral jump scare, I have to say, is, do you remember in the asteroid field what Leia sees when she looks out the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon?
Yes.
Wham! It's
The
the
Mynock.
and it comes out of nowhere. And it's actually quite sickly, unsettling squeal and noise it makes. The fact that they've got the prosthetics rubber just kind of sticking to the windshield of the Falcon works in so many ways for me. The second time I felt scared in Star Wars, I would say, is probably being in your infancy, seeing Return of the Jedi. The entire devil's pact that the Emperor is offering to Luke, with Vader on his side, the entire soundtrack and score that John Williams made and that Ben Burtt helped orchestrate, and has obviously been edited and directed perfectly, makes Palpatine's presence with his musical themes just something that wrinkles under my skin. It doesn't scare me, but it unsettles me. And I think it worked fantastically to one of the Rise of Skywalker's actual strengths in Exegol, because they kind of ranked that up to 11 and brought in the kind of chilling feel of the Sith, and this entire army of ghosts that Palpatine has in this kind of auditorium chanting these Sith sorcery words. And while not directly horror, I'd say that's definitely horror adjacent, and at the very least was very unsettling to me. And then lastly, and I know I've kind of cheated with Palpatine mentioning him in both Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, but I would say just the physical kind of body horror of Anakin's immolation scene on the banks of Mustafar after the duel with Obi-Wan in Revenge of the Sith. Because the first time I think anyone sees that, whether you're a kid, a teen, an adult, or a little older, has to hit you hard because it's executed so well visually and in every way.
I would say the original Halloween is top.
Mhm.
Alien, the original. Freaks, the Warner Brothers film from 1932. That is excellent. Original Last House on the Left, and coupled with original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because the scripts in both of them aren't very good, which I think contributes to the strength of the movies because they feel more real and they look like they're home movies. Like they're kind of schlocky, kind of like it's shot, and it just feels a lot more disturbing and real when it's not like perfect, you know. But horror,
Definitely.
you know, it's even then it's kind of difficult because it's not like a movie that maintains that kind of suspense all the way through is really difficult to come across. Like The Witch does an excellent job at atmosphere. John Carpenter's The Thing, that's also a really great horror film. Or
that's one I cannot do. I just cannot. The John Carter is The Thing.
Really?
Yeah, I've avoided that film so many times. But yeah, it's the physical kind of prosthetics and body horror that I think works so well in that. That's where I just feel uncomfortable and grossed out rather than scared. I don't want to be grossed out by a film really much at all. Whereas I do want to feel the thrill and the scare and the kind of jumps and the adrenaline rush.
You see, I thought that movie had a real eeriness to it because it's like you don't know who it is. And there's so many question marks because they still don't tell you who became the Thing first and who did what. Like you never find out who actually stole the blood from the refrigerator. You never find out who broke into McCree's apartment thing to try and frame him. You never find out how exactly Blair escaped from or when he became the Thing. So there's like all these different kind of questions about when is it, like what's going on, and then just the eerie fatalistic ending to it, you know. When that score by Ennio Morricone, my God, like music is so important to horror, especially like in Halloween. John Carpenter scored that in 3 days.
Yeah, that was incredible.
First submitted it without a score. And the executive's like, there's nothing scary about this movie. It's terrible. So he goes home. He didn't have the money for an orchestra. In the credits, he credits the Bowling Green Orchestra because that's where his school. He came from Bowling Green, Kentucky. So he thought it'd be a funny, cheeky little thing. But he scored it himself at home with his bongos 3-4 times on the piano. And then he brought it back to that same executive 3 days later. And they're like, this is great. And arguably the best score ever to have done it in just 3 days off the cuff like that.
That was a bang for buck for sure.
Bang for buck. And so that because it's funny because he's actually more of a musician now anyway, and has been for a long time. But so yeah, it's very difficult. And even then, those are the ones that come to mind as being iconic. But I'm sure there's a ton I'm not thinking of, like straight up drama type films like Gone Girl, or like you said, Seven, Hereditary. Movies that just kind of get in your head.
Well, I think there's a ton
Star
of
Wars
stuff.
wise.
Go ahead. Top three Star Wars.
Psychological horror.
It would be the trash compactor scene's probably the top. The Exegol scene, just because the collection of all the Exegol stuff is very cult-like, very kind of eerie. And then
Gothic,
thirdly, I would probably go with, not that scene. Let's see, which scene would I go for? The third would also be like the Minox scene, because not only is it when it hits the window for the jump scare, but it's when they go outside and it's like what exactly is this thing? Like where are they?
Yeah.
And that's kind of a little eerie at first. Or I'd couple that with the Dagobah cave as well. I think I'd tie those two together, because at first you're not really, because Yoda starts building the tension like you don't need to go in there, or you go in there but you don't bring your weapons. It's like what is it in the fog and all that creepy stuff. So yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned Dagobah cave. I think that's what makes Return of the Jedi's throne room scene so visceral to me the first time I ever saw it, because I saw Luke's father in the Darth Vader costume, I didn't see Vader as the mechanical monstrosity at all. I was seeing Luke, or a reflection of Luke in him, and I was thinking, I want you to win as a good guy, but you cannot do this. So it's that kind of pull between what you want to happen and what you think must happen for the hero in the story that really got me. It would be really remiss also that I left the throne of Boba Fett up behind me deliberately to mention the Rancor and not mention it myself. The build up to the Rancor before you know what's down there in Jabba's palace, I think is, I guess, a top 5 scare moment in Star Wars for me.
Completely. Well, and I'm going to stop us right there, not because of time or anything else, because I think this has been a really good topic, and I think, the Force be with us, then we're doing this thing again still next year. Is we have plenty of content again to completely have another Halloween special, because we haven't even touched on so many subgenres of horror. We haven't even touched on the Star Wars terrifying tales, the Star Wars that's like meant to be the spooky kind of thing. So I think look forward to that. And I am sorry, those of you who may have been commenting today, my setup on this remote location not exactly allowing me to monitor the chat, but we'll monitor that on the back end, and we'll respond, and we'll get to you any questions, comments, and things that you may have. So I think until next time, until we see you, I think everybody's going to be off next weekend. I think it's the 5th Sunday. So see our friends over with the Jedi Archives again back in the first part of November. So may the Force be with you.
Yes.